In this lesson, we are going to continue to learn about Reconstruction and look at the different plans of presidential, which would be President Lincoln's and then Johnson's Reconstruction, versus congressional Reconstruction, which would be that under the radical Republicans and those who control the House and Senate. Before then, we're going to review the Reconstruction Amendments, whose goal it was to provide equal rights to all citizens, which included, of course, the freed slaves. The Reconstruction Amendments are the 13th, 14th, and 15th. You can remember them quickly by writing 13, 14, 15 down and writing FCV next to it, and you will have a checklist of what the Reconstruction Amendments mean. The 13th, of course, was what formally abolished slavery in the United States. It would take military intervention to enforce and make a reality, but the 13th Amendment was the official end of slavery in the United States. The 14th overturned the Dred Scott decision, saying that the freedmen are now citizens of the United States, no longer property, and not even considered an alien as an immigrant would be considered until they passed the citizenship test. They are official citizens, no need to take a citizenship test, no need to wait a period of years. They immediately were granted citizenship. And, of course, the 15th Amendment, which gave all male citizens the right to vote, which was partially motivated by the Republican Party and its goal to secure its political power. As we learned, the 13th Amendment brought freedom to the slaves and brought social change for Southern African Americans. During this time, they worked to consolidate their families, establish a network of churches and other autonomous institutions, claim equal citizenship, which is really the 14th, get an education. The Freedmen's Bureau would be glad to help with that with their 1,000 schools, carve out as much independence as possible in their lives. And initially, there was little change for the white population. We learned that a large failure of Reconstruction and a demonstration that the white South would be unwilling to recognize the social and political rights of newly freed slaves was the passage of the Black Codes, which were designed to return the freedmen to the plantations and in a state like slavery. The social classes, as we learned, remained fairly stable, with the planter elite who owned the land at the top. We learned that the separation and loss of control of African Americans, or over the control over African Americans, led to anxiety among whites and causes the formation of these terror vigilante groups, such as the most well-known, the KKK, or the Ku Klux Klan, which we will learn about in greater lesson, or in future lessons, who made it their goal to keep African Americans in their place socially, politically, and economically. In this lesson, we are going to look at the 3 different plans of Reconstruction. Now, Lincoln, of course, had the first plan, and it's part of presidential Reconstruction. Presidential Reconstruction had one major goal. Presidential Reconstruction's goal was to unify the nation. The nation had been torn apart by the Civil War, And Lincoln had a rather easy Reconstruction plan that was not very harsh on the South at all, where he wanted the South to willingly accept the federal government and become part of the United States again. So Lincoln's goal, which is called presidential Reconstruction, which Johnson would continue, was to unify the nation and bring the United States back together. Before we begin the notes, let's look at Lincoln's plan. Lincoln's Reconstruction plan, which would be part of presidential Reconstruction, really consisted of two parts. One is that state governments must recognize that the end of slavery has occurred. And two, that 10% of each southern state's population must swear allegiance formally to the Union before they could reconstitute their state governments and send representation to Congress. He hoped this would make them surrender and become part of the United States. Oh, an important fact I missed is that Lincoln came up with this plan actually during the Civil War, which was not a harsh plan, hoping that the southern states would see that there was not going to be serious retribution from the North for the Civil War. Said, hey, this is all I want. Surrender, please. 10% of your state swear allegiance and recognize the end of slavery. You must recognize the end of slavery. That is over. And this is it. You can become part of the United States again. Once again, this presidential Reconstruction plan's goal was to unify the nation again, and even to begin this process during the Civil War. So, let's go ahead and begin the notes looking at Lincoln, Johnson, and a group called the Radical Republicans' Reconstruction Plan. Lincoln's plan, two parts, which was developed during the Civil War, before the war actually ended. Its purpose was to end the war as soon as possible and reunify the nation. Let's get a quick sketch of Abe here, which probably won't be fantastic because I'm drawing it very quickly. But Lincoln's plan was simple. The goal was to end the war as soon as possible and bring about the unification of the nation. And it consisted of recognizing the end of slavery and swearing. When 10% of the state swears allegiance to the Union, they can reconstitute their state governments and possibly send representatives to the capital. So Lincoln's plan consisted of the 10% statute and recognizing the end of slavery. Once again, the goal of Lincoln's plan was to end the war and unify the nation. This is what's known as, or this is part of presidential Reconstruction. When Lincoln was assassinated, Andrew Johnson, his vice president, took over, and this largely left Lincoln's plan unchanged. Johnson continued the 10% policy, allowing the southern government, the southern states to reconstitute their state governments once 10% has sworn allegiance. And also, Johnson added an additional part. I'm going to put C right here, two actual additional parts. By Johnson's time, the 13th Amendment had been passed, and he required that southern states ratify, hold a convention and officially ratify the 13th Amendment, recognizing the end of slavery. But then the part that was already talked about and really causes a change in the dynamics of Reconstruction and the plans of the Freedmen's Bureau to give freedmen the confiscated and abandoned lands of the Southern elite plantation owners, was that Johnson required the Southern plantation owners to be humiliated by making them ask for a pardon. As has been described before, this pardon would absolve them of any wrongdoing, and this would then have to result in the government giving back their land, because if they said they did nothing wrong, they have no justification to take their land. So, by making the Southern elite beg for a pardon, which was to humiliate them, he actually helped them out, because when he pardoned them, the government could not take their property anymore because they said they did nothing wrong or they were forgiven. So, due to the fact of the Bill of Rights and cannot seize property, they had to return the land. And this resulted in the freedmen being kicked off the land and really the beginning of the sharecropping system in the South, which would replace slavery. So here is Johnson again and his three parts, which was also presidential Reconstruction. And because it was from him, the one that took over for Lincoln. And it was the same. The goal was to unify the nation, just as in Lincoln's plan. He continued Lincoln's 10% policy. He continued the fact that the states must recognize the end of slavery, except by now the 13th Amendment was passed, so he required them to ratify the 13th Amendment. But then the part that messes everything up was the adding of requiring that the elite request a pardon. And Johnson quickly granted these pardons to prominent Southerners who requested them. And by now, we know the effect of those pardons on all the parties involved. Freedmen kicked off their land because the Southern landowners get it back. We just talked about the presidential Reconstruction plans. Now, we're now going to talk about congressional Reconstruction plans, which were carried out by a group called the Radical Republicans. While presidential Reconstruction plans had their own objectives, by the time of Congress's plan, there were other objectives. The reasons were Congress passed a Reconstruction plan were it saw that the rights of newly freed slaves needed protected. And it was to also protect the Republicans' political power, which was in jeopardy from actions of the Southern states. One of the reasons they passed this was while Congress was not in session. South Carolina and other Southern legislatures passed the Black Codes, and they elected former Confederates to Congress. Congress refused to admit these returning Southern officials. Increased violence against the freedmen and President Johnson's opposition to congressional efforts to secure the rights of the freedmen by vetoing the extension of the Freedmen's Bureau and Johnson's opposition to the 14th Amendment significantly changed the recourse of Reconstruction policy. So Johnson opposed equal citizenship. He accepted and encouraged the freedom of slaves, but did not endorse their citizenship. And as a result of the voting public's reaction to violence in the South, the radical Republicans, who would control Congress and initiate congressional Reconstruction, won majority in the congressional elections of 1866 and passed what's called Congressional Reconstruction. So, in 1866, the radical Republicans were elected to Congress, and they passed a Congressional Reconstruction plan. And Congressional Reconstruction, its goal would be to protect the freedmen from the actions of the former Confederate states, who were now doing everything in their power to keep African Americans in a state of fear, second-class citizenship, and having any political power whatsoever. As was said in the previous PowerPoint slide, the radical Republicans passed their own Reconstruction plan, and it consisted of a couple parts. Part one, and this resulted in the only instance of this to ever occur, was Johnson was impeached because he was blocking the efforts of the radical Republicans. So, part one, Johnson is impeached. Now, part two, we'll talk about in a few minutes, but let's talk and review the reasons. One of the reasons, and this is the only way that I could think to describe this, is that ex-Confederates were elected to Congress, which, of course, these would have been the hardliners, the fire eaters that wanted to secede, and now they're back in the government. Because naturally, if the southern states held a democracy or held an election where the people were going to decide, they're most likely going to decide upon these ex-Confederates to represent them. And this is partially why the 14th Amendment voted that Congress must vote to give amnesty to former Confederates. Because can you imagine fire eaters coming in to Congress and what type of problems they were going to cause? Congress, of course, refused to admit them. You can't come in. Now, the main reason that was talked about, Congress took over Reconstruction, is they had to protect the freedmen's rights. Because the southern states were doing everything in their power to remove them, remove their rights, and keep them in a state like slavery. This includes the passage of the Black Codes, which were very discriminatory laws designed to get the freedmen to return to their plantations and pretty much become slave labor again. So, part one, impeach Johnson. These are the reasons why Congress took over and congressional Reconstruction began. Partially because of the black codes to protect the rights of the freedmen, because of the former Confederates that were elected to Congress. The KKK and other terror groups were running wild. Now, the other actual parts of the Reconstruction Plan were that, two, the military was sent to the South to enforce all of the Reconstruction Amendments which had been passed by then, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. And the third part, the South was split into 5 military districts which would be occupied by the military, where South Carolina and North Carolina were District 1, District 3 was Florida, Alabama, and Georgia, District 4, Arkansas, Louisiana, and Mississippi, and District 5, I believe, was just Texas. So the 3 parts of their Reconstruction Plan was the South was split into military districts with a military governor. The military was sent to enforce the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, and Johnson was impeached for blocking their efforts. As part of Reconstruction, South Carolina refused to recognize the 14th and 15th Amendments, so they were forced to write a new Constitution. Which we will visit that in the PowerPoint here in a minute. So here are the 3 parts of the Radical Reconstruction Plan. Congressional Reconstruction. Military occupation of the former Confederacy, splitting it into 5 military districts with a military governor and army to enforce its provisions. South Carolina was District 2. South Carolina's military governor was named General Sickles, who we'll see here. Part 2, Congress impeached Johnson to ensure that as Commander-in-Chief he could not undermine its efforts. And 3, the Union Army attempted to enforce the Reconstruction policy and the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. Here is a map of the military districts of the South. South Carolina, the main thing you need to know possibly is it was District 2 along with North Carolina. You can see I messed up a little bit. Arkansas and Mississippi was number 4. Texas was number 5. Texas and Louisiana. And here is the military governor, General Sickles, who was South Carolina's military governor. And part of Congressional Reconstruction, not a plan, but it occurred, was South Carolina refused to recognize the 14th and 15th Amendments, so they were forced to hold a convention and write a new state constitution. This occurred in 1868, and it was South Carolina's constitution for a while. This concludes our lesson on Reconstruction. We will look at some more successes and failures of Reconstruction in the next lessons, and it would have been an okay time for African Americans, and things would have been okay had they lasted. However, Reconstruction ends in 1876. The military's pulled out, and it's a dark time for African Americans in the South for about 70 years after. Those are the subjects of future lessons. Until then, thank you for listening. I hope you did well.